Come sta, professor Emanuele?
Molto bene, Burcu, grazie. Grazie per questo invito. Thank you for this invitation. It's a pleasure to be here with you, Burcu. Thank you. Speaking of John Fante.
Oh, thank you, grazie. Benvenuto nel nostro podcast. È così bello essere qui con te. Thank you for being here. And now I want to begin with first question.
Yes.
If you are ready. What is the reason for John Fante's late recognition and still having less recognition in these days?
You know, Burcu, this is partially true. This is a little urban legend, because if you think about that, already in his 20s, John Fante published his stories in very important literary magazines, and he published 2 novels with good publishers. And it's true that they didn't sell a lot, but still it was considered a kind of golden boy of American literature, an enfant prodige, so that he was translated in Italian. At the beginning of the 40s, Italians were starting to discover American literature, thanks to an anthology of American writing edited by Elio Vittorini. It was very important. It was called Americana. It's 1941. In this anthology, John Fante was there. So it's not completely true that he was not recognized. It's true then he started to work in Hollywood. He was married, 4 children, and so he had to support his family. And so he lost some discipline in writing. He published a collection of stories in 1940, and then in 1952, his most successful book, Full of Life. That was a success. They made a movie from that book. It is his worst book from an artistic point of view, and then we can talk about that if you want to. But yes, and then at the end of his life, yes, he was forgotten, then rediscovered at the end of his life, and then we have Fante's resurrection after his widely published in the whole world. And actually is a cult writer. His fans love him without much discrimination. And so yes, I would say that it's not completely true that he was not recognized. It's true, for example, that is recognized better, much better in Europe, France, Germany, Italy. I don't know Turkey, actually. Is well known in Turkey, Burcu?
No.
Not so much. Well, in Italy, absolutely yes. In France, absolutely yes. In Germany, absolutely yes. In America, not so much. Why? For me, there are a couple of reasons. For me, one reason is his peculiar humor. His humor is Pirandellian humor. In 1907, Luigi Pirandello defined humor as a double-sided mask. One side is laughing, and one side is crying. And he gives us an example. When we look at an old woman, for example, made up like a parrot, he says, so with too much makeup, very short skirt, etc., we laugh. No? In a very mean way, we laugh. But immediately after that, we think, well, but this woman, she just wants to recover her youth, like everybody else. So it's something very human. So first we laugh, but then we reflect and we are slightly sad. Humor is also empathic. We realize that we are not different from the old lady. So this humor is the humor we find in John Fante's novel. It's humor that makes everything ambiguous. It questions and challenges any truth. As a matter of fact, in John Fante's novel, you won't find any absolute truth. Nothing is true. There is not a political, moral, religious, social message. And this is something Americans do not like so much. They like to have a truth with a capital T. They like to have a message, while what Fante is never imposing any personal idea, any value, any truth. Fante also is not describing America as great, and Americans like to see its country as the greatest. Well, you don't find that in Fante. America maybe is not so great as Americans like to think it is, without any doubt. So these could be some reasons for which Fante, at least in America, is not much recognized as the great writer he is.
And so you are a writer. It's so special for me. And what is the meaning of writing for John Fante? What do you think? What is his why?
Yes. Also, you know what? Let me add something else. Just one thing. His only successful book, as we said at the beginning of our conversation, is Full of Life, 1952. This is the only Fante's book with a very clear moral message, and therefore without a trace of humor. And that was the only book that was successful. This is interesting. John Fante writes because for him, writing is a joy, is a pleasure, is fulfillment. His only goal is producing something beautiful. And for him, something beautiful means electric, visceral, musically clean, limpid, lyrical. And this could be also another reason for which Fante is not so much appreciated in America. The kind of lyrical prose Fante performs. And this writing, so this is his goal. His goal is never confessional. His goal is producing something beautiful. And this comes often by the clash of opposite forces, desire and failure, essentially. Being Italians in America and wishing to be recognized as only Americans. The father and the son, the dream of being a great Latin lover and the sexual failure. The feeling of being Prince Charming and then unrequited love. So there is always this clash of forces from which Fante's prose with its electricity was born. It's very important for me, Burku, to underline one thing that, yes, Fante uses his life as a main material of his works. His life and his and specifically his family, correct? But this does not mean that his writing is autobiographical. This is just this is clay in his hands. The best way for him to produce beautiful sentences, because in that material he finds the opposite forces we were talking about.
Then what is the relationship between Italian-American writer John Fante and Italian-American writer Arturo Bandini?
And Italian-American Bandini, you mean?
Yeah.
Well, there is something important to understand, that John Fante is writing about Arturo Bandini. Arturo Bandini is an Italian-American young writer, and John Fante is slightly older. So he has the advantage of his age, of staying at the table and writing about himself, yes, but to make fiction of himself. So as everybody else, Arturo Bandini is suffering his condition of being an Italian-American, of being an Italian in America. John Fante is writing about that. That's his material. So he actually can write about being an Italian-American through the instrument of reflection and humor. Arturo Bandini is an Italian-American guy without any humor, because he's living his life. As everybody else, we live our life at the moment. Only after a few years, as you know, Burku, we can think about stuff that happened and maybe realizing that they were not so bad as we thought they were. We have humor. Humor comes with age and reflection. But when we live our life in that moment, we're always dramatic, especially when we are very young. Every little thing, the end of a love is terrible, is tragedy, is pure death. And then after a few years, we look back and we think, well, maybe it was not so bad. It was not such a big deal. We have experience, we have maturity, and we have humor. So John Fante is describing as this Italian-American guy through the filter of humor. It's also interesting to think about something else, that John Fante analyzes what psychologically means to be a young Italian-American, actually an American born son of Italians in the 30s. Psychologically, there is nothing that really happens if not in Arturo's mind. Everything happens in Arturo's mind. I hope I was clear.
I wonder, how does John Fante relate to humor and the inner conflicts of his characters, human psychology in general?
Can you repeat? I did not understand very well. Can you repeat, please?
How does humor work in his novels, like in relationship with the inner conflicts and human psychology in general?
In the psychology of the characters, you mean?
Yeah, and humor.
Yes, well, humor is not in the characters. It's always in the other. Humor is the gift of the others. Arturo, and the characters do not have humor. They are not aware of what they are living. They just live. We perceive humor in what they do. When we read John Fante's novel, it's very interesting. The stories are not actually happy stories, but we always have a smile on our face.
Mm-hmm.
Why? Because of humor, for sure. Humor is the main instrument of John Fante's as a writer. And also this not only that anyway, we love so much and we feel happy when we read these sad stories because of the energy and the beauty of the prose. There is such an energy, such an electricity in each sentence. So it doesn't matter that those stories are often very sad, because we are speaking especially often, yes, they are not happy stories with happy ending. Still, the readers are happy. And that's the great gift of beauty and humor.
Yes, I didn't think in this way. I thought Bandini was being funny. But after reading your thesis, I changed my mind.
Well, for me, it's absolutely to understand. It's absolutely important. You can enjoy fantasy novels, but you appreciate the art of the writer when you see how, in a very subtle way, is using humor. Most of the time, it's a very is not always understandable. You don't realize it immediately, but you read carefully, you will realize that really almost between the lines, there is this humor. Yes, you perceive that, but then, and this, it gives you the joy of reading because of that. But it's very, very subtle and very, very intelligent. That's why, yes, his prose is visceral, is hormonal, that's true. But we should not make the mistake of thinking Fante as a naive writer. And that's why all the writers, especially in Italy, who try to imitate his prose, thinking that it's just they have just to put their guts on the table to be visceral. Well, their novels are failures. They are just ridiculous. Fante is a very good writer from that point of view. His prose and his writing seems very simple, but it's not so simple as it seems.
And what impressed you most in Fante's use of humor? As a writer, what do you think about the humor, the importance of using that?
Well, I think that it creates a book who always it gives a different color, because is much more intellectually refined than irony and satire. Fante uses also irony and satire. Still, humor is much a tool, much more refined. And but you know what? It's not only humor that I like in Fante's novels. I like this powerful ability to recreate youth, for example, through the character of Bandini. I mean, if you have just a grain of humor, you will realize that you are Bandini, that you have been Bandini, that everybody has been Arturo Bandini, because Bandini is essentially the young man with these feelings of omnipotence, and a second later frustration. This excitement of big dreams and the fear of never accomplishing them. The feeling to be the best, and 1 minute later, the feeling of being just ridiculous, to be losers. So this is youth. This is youth. Youth is a clash of forces. It's wonderful because of this, because of its opposite sides. This is the beauty, and this is the beauty that we can find through the character of Arturo Bandini. By reading John Fante, I always find consolation. I smile and I laugh because, and sometimes I feel sad because in Arturo's Bandini, I remember myself as I was. So my desires, my frustrations, side by side, together, almost in the same minute. Youth is a wonderful age because we live it without, most of the time, the gift of irony, the gift of humor. Humor is something that comes later. As I told you, we suffer so much for the most stupid things. And only a few years later, or sometimes later, thinking through the filter of humor, we realize that, oh my God, why did I cry so much for that boy or for that girl, or just for that things that didn't work out? Who cares? Why I was so intense? Because you were young, and when we are young, we are intense. We are wonderfully stupid, like Arturo Bandini. That's the magic of youth.
And I was preparing this podcast, and at 3 a.m. almost, I was reading Fante, and again, and I was just so happy, smiling on the couch, even though I had a bad day. So it means a lot to me.
Burku, let me say hello to a couple of friends. I saw Paolo Ivaldi and Enrico Grandesso. They are two friends from Italy, Enrico and Paolo, and I'm very happy they are here with me today. And they are two writers as well. Wow. Both Paolo and Enrico are writers. So it's full of writers, Burku.
Oh, welcome, writers. It's like
everybody writes.
Club. And welcome again.
Writing was also an important topic for Fante. Throughout his 8 novels, he writes speaking of writing. And my impression, as I was telling you before, is that for him, and maybe also for me, if I can, because at the end, we read, when we read an author, we read some novels, is because in these books we find something we are looking for, something that a connection. And for him, for Fante, writing, yes, was giving shape to a shapeless life, maybe to understand better himself and the world. And from this point of view also, when I write to understand better myself and the world, to become a better person.
So nice. And my next question is that, let me read a passage. In the road to Los Angeles, Bandini says, a name for endless ages, Arturo Gabriel Bandini, an even better sounding name than Dante Gabriel Rossetti. And he was an Italian too. He belonged to my race. For example, here we see a Bandini who is happy because he is an Italian, while in some places we see a Bandini who is not that happy and called as being woke, and he wants to be an American.
Exactly. This is
So-
still the clash in Fante's prose. Bandini wants to be an American that is a winner, because Italy, that is his Italian family, means poverty, humiliation, defeat. So when he feels America welcomes him, accepts him, he rejects his Italian roots as a sign of shame. But when he feels America rejects him, he goes back to Italy as a place of old good values and warmth. And this is all, of course, in Bandini's mind and actions. Fante's novel could be interesting to be analyzed, as I told you, to understand the psychology of a young American son of Italians in the 40s.
And I will read one more passage. In Wait Until Spring, Pandini, there's a passage that is very interesting.
Yes.
It says, Federico has a cold, she said. He too had a cold in his soul. And again, he continues, did you ever say, Sivevo, my beloved, how is your soul these days? Here Bandini criticized that his father, Sivevo Bandini, is not asked by his mom how Sivevo's soul is. So my question is, if we think about his novels, John Fante's novels, what is the relationship Fante establishes between the flesh and the soul? Does one outweigh another?
Yes. But you know, also soul and flesh are material of his art. There is not in Fante's works a separation between flesh and soul. Fante investigates in the flesh and in the soul of his characters with the same pleasure, I would say. Also, I would say that flesh and soul are a kind of metaphor for each other. Let me give you a couple of examples. Arturo suffers for being short, as he suffers to be Italian. So, in a parallel way, he suffers to be excluded. He suffers because he feels inferior. While anyway, Arturo rebels against his condition. He doesn't want to be short. He wants to be tall. He wants the glory. He wants to be American. His mother accepts that. His mother was born in America and is an Italian American. She accepts not to be an American woman. This is the great discrimination. She's Italian, she's not American. And we can read in Wait Until Spring, Bandini. She looks at the American women, and American women are all beautiful and glamorous because they are American. But she's Italian. She cannot be that. It's not that she's not. She cannot be that because she's Italian. She cannot be beautiful like the Americans. And so in a kind of self-punishment, she even gets uglier. She doesn't do anything, actually the opposite, to look a little better. And indeed, Arturo's mother looks old even when she's in her 30s. You understand? So there is this, yes, it's flesh and soul are kind of a metaphor for each other. There is not a distinction. But still, let me repeat that, it's very important. Everything for Fante is not goal. The only goal is producing something beautiful. When his idea of producing something beautiful was essentially in his favorite novel was Hunger by Knut Hamsun, Norwegian Nobel Prize. And actually, if you read The Road to Los Angeles, as almost plagiarism, is the same novel. Just The Road to Los Angeles is set in Los Angeles, while Hunger by Knut Hamsun is set in Kristania in Norway. But they're very, very, very similar. The humor is the same. And that's the idea of a beautiful prose Fante had in his mind. This very visceral, intense, powerful, hormonal prose. There is not a weak sentence. There is not a weak word in Fante. All of them are very strong, very intense, very lyrical also, and colorful.
Well, in Esther Dust, the part in which Vera Rifkin is ashamed of her body is important and emotional for me.
I understand, yes.
I just believe that in my humble opinion, Fante shows us that we are more than body because he puts such a part. Right. It was very powerful for me reading these passages about Vera.
Burkuba, absolutely, but of course, an artist, if he's an artist, thinks that we are much more than body, of course. Of course. I mean, otherwise it would not be an artist. Otherwise, Fante would not have spent all his life regretting of not writing fiction. Because he was earning a lot of money in Hollywood. He was a rich man playing golf, but his mind was always going back to writing fiction because is in the, and that is a matter of soul. Is in that art he recognized himself. He found fulfillment. You understand? I don't think that there is an art that is not interested in the soul and in the psychology of human being. I mean, a novelist needs to know the soul of his characters, because a novel without basic knowledge of psychology is not a novel. But even though if you want to write a mystery novel or fantasy novel, crime story, whatever, but you need to enter your characters at least basic psychology. Otherwise, it doesn't work. Yes.
And you establish a relationship between Don Quixote and Arturo Bandini.
Oh, yes, yes.
What kind of relationship do you think?
Well, Don Quixote was one of my favorite journeys in my life. I still remember the joy of reading Don Quixote, a book full of humor. That means very funny and very sad almost at the same time. and about a world of mean people with two good characters, Don Quixote and Sancho Panza. So the only two completely crazy people were also the good ones. and both Don Quixote, I'm thinking of this parallelism comparison between Don Quixote and Fante's characters in two novels, Wait Until Spring Bandini and 1933 Was a Bad Year. And according to me, it is pretty evident. Both Don Quixote and Sancho Panza and Bandini, father and son, actually in 1933 was a bad year. They are not called Bandini, they are Molise, but it doesn't matter. Let's call them Bandini. So Don Quixote, Sancho, and father and son in Fante's novels are dreamers. And the most important thing, they support each other's dreams. What does it mean? When one is discouraged, the other helps him to recover the dimension of the dream. So when one of the two characters has his dreams crushed, the other one is pushing him, and the dream is again there like a beautiful sun in front of them. For all these four characters, Burku, preserving the dream is more important than fulfilling the dream. A fulfilled dream is always disappointing because it's not a dream anymore, of course. It's just reality. Something Don Quixote, Sancho, and the Bandinis do not like much. They do not fit to, and they are unable to deal with. And I don't know if you read, if you read, there is the same concept in Truman Capote's last unfinished novel, Answered Prayers. Answered Prayers, why? Because there are more tears for the prayers that were answered than for the unanswered prayers. And Oscar Wilde was saying, when gods want to punish you, they fulfill your dreams. And this is Don Quixote, Sancho, and the Bandinis in the same title. The same title, Wait Until Spring, Bandini. Spring is the hope for both of them. Bandini is both a son and father. Wait until spring, because with the spring, the father will be able to work again as a bricklayer. And with the spring, Arturo will be able to play baseball, because the fields will be unfrozen. So wait until spring. So there is always an hope in our future. There is always a dream to pursue. And the dream is much more important than an accomplished dream that is not a dream anymore. And these are Don Quixote, same thing, exactly same thing. According to me, it's pretty evident, actually.
Bandini compares himself with Hitler, and he defines Hitler by saying that people will remember his novel in their last breath, and they will smile. Can we read Bandini's Crab Massacre and calling himself Führer Bandini as a critic of Nazi Germany?
No. No, I mean, No, there is never a social criticism. That novel is, we are speaking of The Road to Los Angeles, so it's written in 1935. Well, first of all, would be very superficial. It's just, the focus is not Hitler. The focus is always Arturo and what happens in his mind. Arturo is feeling omnipotent, a violent dictator, while he's killing these crabs. So it's just funny. It's just Bandini who is ridiculous. There is not a social criticism. Will be very, very, very superficial. Bandini, who clearly has a very vague idea of who Hitler was. Bandini is killing these crabs, but here we have again Fante's humor investigating in Bandini's mind. Bandini is a young man, and cruelty and violence can be part of a young man. So this is just a parody of a victim, because remember, Arturo is always a victim. He feels himself a victim, he feels himself a loser. He's very insecure also because he's very poor and is Italian and all that. And so it's a parody of a victim that suddenly becomes the executioner. That's all. But we cannot think that here in this passage it's a ridiculous passage. So really, I don't see, frankly, any social criticism. I don't see social criticism anywhere in John Fante's novels, because he was not interested to. It's clearly not interested to. So when he's writing about the poverty of this family, clearly his goal is the creation of a world and the production of beautiful sentences. The goal is always artistic. It's never social. If it were, it would be a failure. But clearly, Fante is not interested in any social criticism, in any political statement. Absolutely no. Impossible to find, almost impossible to find out something like that in Fante's work. Even, I tell you the truth, Burku, that if you studied the discrimination against Italians, and your only document were Fante's novels, fiction, you would think that this discrimination was not existent, that this discrimination was only in the mind of Italians. Because actually most of the time, the Americans in Fante's novels are nice with the Italian characters. So nothing serious happens. We do not have any discrimination. Really, there was discrimination. We know that, but not because but if we read only Fante's novel, our impression would be that this discrimination was only in the mind of the Italian Americans. So not real. Not real.
And how does intellectual arrogance manifest itself in Fante's novels? For example, Bandini says, like, someone reading Nietzsche in a place like that, like he's teasing with people around him?
Ma Burku, Bandini, Arturo is arrogant because he's young. He's young. But also this arrogance comes essentially from his insecurity, clearly from his insecurity. He doesn't see that, if not sometimes. But for the writer and for us readers, it is obvious. So he's arrogant because he feels insecure. Is the arrogance also in that? I think that we can find traces of our youth. When we are young, we are almost naturally arrogant. But most of the time is an arrogance that produces only tenderness. As a matter of fact, we all like Arturo Bandini, even though he's arrogant. Why? Because we realize that his arrogance is just a mask, and it produces tenderness in us, because it's not a real arrogant. It's just young. He's just very young. He's 20 years old with many problems in his mind, because he's Italian, because he's very poor, because he's short. And arrogance is a reaction. I am the best in the world. Why? Because he feels that the world doesn't think the same and won't think the same ever. And so his reaction is this arrogance. But we cannot take it seriously. We cannot take it seriously. And that's why we like him. We like him even when he's very arrogant. When he's arrogant with Camila Lopez in Ask the Dust, he's very arrogant.
Yeah, so much.
We perceive that he's just a man in love with a woman, a young, very young man in love with a woman, who feels his love is unrequited, who is not able to deal with a woman because he's still a child. And so the only way to react to the shame for this weakness, because he would like to be a real man and is not, the only way is this showing off and pretending to be arrogant. But
in Esther Dust, Pandini has an idealization in his mind as the true love, telling even Camilla it wasn't you and it wasn't Federico either. It was just his true love. He said, then how do we interpret Fante's and his novels in terms of love and view of love?
Burku, first let me, I know that I'm going to repeat always the same thing, but there is not a view of love in Fante's novels, because there is not a view of everything, of anything. So really, we can state that in Fante's novels, there is not a point of view. There is not a philosophy. No. But there is Bandini, yes, Burku. There is, of course, especially in Ask the Dust, there is Bandini in love with Camila Lopez. And generally, there is a young man always agitated by an hormonal desire and by romantic dreams. So if you think about this character, Arturo is always sexually very intense. He would like to have all the women in the world. He's attracted by all the women. He wants to be a Latin lover. And then is also, so still we have these two opposite forces. So Bandini sees himself as a great lover and as a romantic lover as well, devoting all his life to only one woman. And yes, Ask the Dust is this story of an unrequited love, but the beauty of it is how Fante, with his sentences, with his language, often lyrical, enters the young heart of his character.
How do the father figure and mother figure differ from each other in Fante's novel?
This is something very interesting, actually. Very interesting. I can tell you this, that the father in Fante's novels are tragic characters.
Mm-hmm.
The mothers in Fante's novels are comical characters. And why? Because Fante is using two different instruments in describing them. Fante is using humor in depicting and portraying the fathers. So, as I told you, according to Pirandello, humor is when you initially laugh and then you think and you do not laugh anymore, even you cry. Okay, and that's how the fathers in Fante's novels are portrayed. We laugh at them, but immediately later we feel there is something very bitter, very, very sad, and we are very empathic with these fathers. The mothers are completely different, because with the mothers, Fante is using another kind of instrument, that is satire. So he satirically attacks the mothers. The mothers is always the hyper-religious type, the woman always in the kitchen. There is not humor, there is satire. And when describing the mother, Fante, yes, change tools of narrative tools. And maybe also to flatter his American audience. Because of course, these Italian American women always praying, always cooking, they were fitting his audience stereotypes. And Fante can be very funny. So he mocks whole Italian superstitions, for example. And so the mothers, at least the Italian American mothers, not the American mothers. The Italian American mothers are ridiculous. We do not have any empathy for them. We laugh at them. Well, we don't feel sorry. Yes, they are pathetic. So yes, from that point of view, we are sorry, but we do not perceive the tragedy of the fathers, because fathers are portrayed with humor. So the ambiguity, there is this ambiguity. While the Italian American mothers are portrayed with satire. So.
Arturo Bandini's artistic solitude. I want to ask question about this. How does this solitude work in terms of his art?
But from this point of view, Burku, I think that the solitude is the only Solitude is the only necessary tool a writer needs, together with talent. Talent and solitude. It's very difficult right now in our age. It's very difficult to be alone, because writing and any kind of art needs focus, needs solitude, needs discipline, and it's very difficult. Both reading and writing are two activities needing us to be alone with ourselves. We are never alone because we have our cell phones, and a message comes or Facebook page is updated and all this stuff, and we do not resist. We need to look at that, and we start to chat. Then we go back to writing. Then we chat again. Then we answer a message. Then we check Facebook page. Doesn't work. We cannot produce something good, but even our reading is spoiled by that. It's very difficult. Reading and writing are two difficult activities, much more difficult than they were 30 years ago, because there were not all these distractions. And really, there is no possibility of reading and writing without an absolute solitude, without focus, without discipline, without the great and forgotten pleasure of staying with yourself and your thoughts without being disturbed by anyone. Yes, and so of course, also Arturo Bandini and Fante's characters have these problems. For example, in the last novel, Arturo does not produce anything written. Why? Because he's involved in the Hollywood machine, and there are all these distractions, and he tries to move to a house on the beach, but still he got distractions, and if you get distracted, you cannot write or read. So solitude and the ability, the talent of being alone is absolutely necessary and urgent if you want to be a writer. You should you have to switch off everything, your cell phones, everything. Otherwise,
I wonder that when I look at Bandini, I see a soul that desires to believe rather than an enemy of God. And there is a critical approach to the Catholic Church in many parts of his novels, I think. And Bandini is not a Christian, but could we describe Bandini as an enemy of God, basically? How would you analyze his theological contradiction?
Still, Bandini's approach to religion and Catholicism is another component of his mind, fascinating Fante. Mm-hmm. And Fante's humor works also on this level. Arturo is thirsty for glory, thirsty for women, thirsty for being recognized as an American, not as an Italian. And so he prays God for that. He looks for, because this is in his blood, and sometimes he prays in the last novel. He prays both because he has money. He went to work in Hollywood. He has money, but he wants to write. Mm-hmm. Because he doesn't feel fulfilled without writing. And so he prays, and he prays God and Knut Hamsun. Knut Hamsun is the Fante's favorite author. And so, yes, there is not any criticism of the church, even in The Road to Los Angeles. Of course, Arturo Bandini is attacking the church.
Yes.
still is a ridiculous attack. Is not serious on behalf of Fante. Fante is having fun in describing this young man who read Nietzsche and attacks the church and institutions. But of course, it's too hyperbolic to be taken serious. The only goal in that novel is to make the readers laugh, and they are laughing at Arturo Bandini. There is no criticism of the church. Also, in that novel, it's actually his first novel, no? the Road to Los Angeles. It was rejected. It was written in 1935, and then it was published after his death. And he reads and quotes Nietzsche, and especially Nietzsche against the church. But of course, we realize that he does not understand anything of Nietzsche. It's clear that he's not understanding anything of Nietzsche. Actually, he himself says that he's not understanding anything of Nietzsche. But reading Nietzsche is a mechanism of defense. He's poor, he's Italian. And reading Nietzsche is his way to fight back. Reading Nietzsche is his way to despise a word that he feels it despises him. Reading Nietzsche is his revenge. But this is something that we still do, and that's why I like Fante, because Fante anyway is anticipating stuff. If some, you know what? Also in Facebook, Burku, you are not in Facebook, but in Facebook, I know I see these people mentioning that they read this book and the other book and the other book and pretending to discuss. It's clear to me that they don't actually. Also, because reading should be a very silent and egoistical pleasure that you do for yourself. You don't need to share the news. I read Proust, please clap me. You understand? So these people, I have the impression they are reading just to say they read, to announce the people, I read Marcel Proust. You understand? So there is the vanity of, we did not have this 30 years ago. People read because they like to read. Now, because of the social, we read in order to to tell the news that we are readers, and so that we are more intelligent than the others. There is this vanity of reading.
Yes.
I mean, if you are an idiot and you read 1,000 books, you are still an idiot, believe me. I mean, but and so of course Arturo is quoting, reading and quoting Nietzsche. He does not understand a word of Nietzsche, and it is pretty clear from the text. But this is his way to feel a kind of superiority, because of course he feels inferior. He's insecure.
My last question, as a writer, how would you interpret the joy of writing, both in your own life and through the novels of John Fante? And how does writing affect your way of handling of life's distress?
But in a certain way, I think that I do not have maybe his obsessions, but I write for similar reasons Fante was writing. There is this thing that I think is very fascinating for me. It's very interesting. In 1982, because of diabetes, Fante became blind, totally blind, and his feet were amputated. So he was dying. Still, on his deathbed, he dictated his last novel, Dreams from Bunker Hill, and the word dreams was in the title. It's unbelievable for me how much stronger the pleasure of writing and composing sentences must be to dictate a novel on your deathbed without feet and completely blind. It's fantastic, according to me. It's wonderful. Yes, personally, I write for the pleasure of writing, and Fante, I think he did the same. For me, I can tell you this. I have this desire of producing something beautiful, of composing words and sentences in an unusual and original way. Writing for me is a way to be a musician, to be a painter, to be an architect, because I want my sentences having the rhythm, the color, and balance. As I told you before, for me, writings means to give shape to shapeless life, to understand myself and the world a little better, and maybe to become a better person, to portray people, even a tree, anything, to transform something common in something unique because mine. So to transform the mud of our everyday life in gold. Whatever gets lost, or whatever maybe we do not consider because it looks banal, well, when it's transformed on the page, it's not banal anymore. That's all.
And it's very interesting that in some parts, Bandini is afraid of losing his eyes and his hands. And it impresses me a lot that Fante lost his eyes.
Yes, like Borges. Borges actually, most of his life, I think, he became blind very, very soon. And I'm very surprised. There is a story in Borges where the Borges is meeting Borges. I think that the title of the Borges is Borges and I. And young Borges is meeting old Borges, and old Borges is telling young Borges, "You're going to become blind. Oh, don't worry, it's not a big deal."
Grazie.
Grazie Burku, grazie a te, grazie mille. It was a pleasure. I hope I was not boring. I hope we can. We did a good service to John Fante, and thank you. It was very, very nice to have a conversation with you. And thank you to Paolo, Professor Melli, Enrico, Alessandra, who are here. I don't see anyone else, but still, it was very a pleasure and honor for me to be with you, Burku. And as I told you, as Humphrey Bogart says, I hope this is the beginning of a great friendship.
Oh, thank you so much. And